The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and Master Sergeant Danny Kovac had made his last one 30 seconds ago. His Humvee lay on its side, wheels still spinning uselessly against the Afghan sky, black smoke pouring from the engine block, where the IED had caught them at the worst possible angle. His driver wasn't moving. The gunner had been thrown clear, probably dead before he hit the ground. Kovac could taste copper and dust, could feel the hot wetness spreading across his left side where shrapnel had found the gap in his armor. Through the ringing in his ears came the sound he'd been dreading, the sharp crack of AK-47 fire, close and getting closer. The Taliban patrol had been shadowing them for 2 clicks, waiting for exactly this moment. Now they were closing in for confirmation kills, and Kovac had maybe 90 seconds before they reached effective range. His rifle had been ripped from his hands in the blast. His sidearm felt like it weighed 50 pounds as he pulled it from the holster with fingers that didn't want to cooperate anymore. 9 rounds. He could hear them shouting to each other in Pashto, their voices carrying across the dry stream bed where the convoy had been funneled. Command knew they were hit. The radio call had gone out before the blast, but the closest QRF was 20 minutes out, and Kovac didn't have 20 minutes. He had maybe 2. The mathematics of it were brutally simple. He pressed his back against the undercarriage of the Humvee, watching his blood darken the sand beneath him, and tried to remember a prayer his grandmother had taught him. The words wouldn't come. Just the sound of boots on rock getting closer. Just the wheeze of his own breathing getting shallower. Just the acceptance settling into his bones that this patch of nothing, this unnamed bend in a dried-up river valley, would be where his story ended. Then he heard it distant at first, almost lost in the ringing but growing. A sound he knew. A sound that shouldn't exist out here, not this far from any forward operating base, not responding this fast. The distinctive howl of twin turbofans, angry and unmistakable, cutting through the morning air like a chainsaw through silk. An A-10 thunderbolt. Kovac's eyes tracked the sky, squinting against the sun, and found the profile he'd memorized from 100 briefings. But something was wrong with it. The right engine was trailing smoke, dark and heavy. The left wing showed visible damage, panels missing, exposing framework beneath. The thing was flying crooked, compensating for damage that should have grounded it, maybe should have killed it. The Taliban heard it too. Their fire slackened, voices rising in alarm. Then the Warthog dropped low, so low Kovac could see the scoring on its belly where something had tried very hard to bring it down and failed. The nose pitched down. And the GAU-8 Avenger opened up. The sound of the 30mm rotary cannon is something no recording can properly capture. It's not a rattle or a buzz. It's a roar that comes from somewhere primal, something that bypasses the ears and goes straight to the brainstem. 2,000 rounds per minute, each projectile the size of a beer bottle, designed to kill Soviet tanks. Against human targets, the effect is biblical. Kovac watched the world come apart in a line that moved with geometric precision across the streambed. Rocks exploded into powder. The earth itself seemed to heave upward, desperate to escape what was carving through it. Where there had been men moving with tactical purpose, there was suddenly nothing but dust and physics. The Warthog pulled up hard, the damaged engine screaming in protest, and banked in a turn that physics said shouldn't be possible with that much structural damage. Kovac could see the pilot now through the canopy small frame, movements precise despite what had to be a cockpit full of warning lights and alarms. The aircraft came around for another pass, slower this time, lower. The targeting pod beneath the nose swept the terrain with deliberate care. 3 more insurgents had been trying to flank from the north. They broke cover, running for the tree line 200 meters distant. They almost made it. The cannon spoke again, shorter bursts this time, surgical. Then silence except for the wounded howl of those twin engines and the small sounds of the desert resettling itself. The A-10 made one more pass, wings wagging in the traditional gesture target destroyed, you're clear, then began a climb that looked more like a controlled fall upward. Kovac pressed his hand harder against his side and keyed his radio with fingers that had gone numb. Hog 7-3, this is ground element. You just saved my life. What's your status? Static, then a voice, female, tight with controlled pain and something else, exhaustion maybe, or resignation. Ground element Hog 73. Status is complicated. Took AAA over Helmand Province 40 minutes ago. Lost hydraulics, lost the right engine, navigation is partially down. Running on prayers and spite at this point. Kovac tried to laugh and tasted more blood. Got a name I can put in my report. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice came back, it carried weight that had nothing to do with rank. Call sign is Revenant. Name's Lieutenant Kiera Moss, and I'd appreciate it if you forgot you saw me this far off mission profile. The A-10 was barely a speck now, trailing that ribbon of dark smoke like a banner, headed southwest toward what Kovac assumed was the nearest base capable of handling an emergency landing. The word Revenant meant something that had returned from the dead, and as the QRF finally arrived and corpsmen swarmed Kovac's position, he found himself wondering about the kind of pilot who earned that call sign and the kind of circumstances that would have her flying 40 minutes past catastrophic damage to answer a distress call that wasn't even in her assigned sector. He wondered if he'd ever get the chance to ask. 3 hours later, sitting in a field hospital with 14 stitches holding his side together and enough morphine in him to make the lights interesting, Kovac learned that Hog 73 had put down at Fob Shank with both engines flamed out, no hydraulics, and landing gear that deployed through gravity alone when the pilot manually released the locks. The aircraft had rolled to a stop 20 feet from a revetment wall. The pilot had walked away from it, refused medical evaluation, and disappeared into a briefing room with 3 full-bird colonels before anyone thought to ask her name. But word traveled fast in deployed spaces, and by evening, Kovac knew the basics. Lieutenant Kiera Moss, call sign Revenant, 3rd deployment to Afghanistan, 14 confirmed close air support missions in the past 6 months alone. Distinguished Flying Cross for an action in the Pech Valley that was still mostly classified. And a reputation that preceded her in the kind of whispered conversation that happened in mess tents and TOC briefings. She was the one you wanted overhead when things went completely sideways. She was also the pilot that some of the older fixed-wing guys called reckless, though never loudly enough for it to go on record. 2 weeks later, Kovac was back at his unit, side still tender but functional, when he heard that Hog 73 had been officially grounded pending investigation into that unauthorized flight profile. The A-10 itself had been damaged beyond field repair and was waiting for transport back to the States for depot-level maintenance. Lieutenant Moss had been reassigned to administrative duties at Kandahar Airfield, flying a desk instead of close air support missions, while a colonel in the Inspector General's office tried to figure out if she should be given another medal or a court-martial. The debate, Kovac heard, was surprisingly heated. The thing about the A-10 Thunderbolt community is that it attracts a specific kind of pilot, the kind who looks at an aircraft designed around a gun so powerful it can slow the plane down when fired and thinks, yes, that's exactly what I want to be strapped into. They call it the Warthog because beautiful it is not. Twin engines mounted high on the fuselage to minimize ground fire vulnerability. Titanium bathtub cockpit that can take hits that would down any other aircraft. Straight wings designed for loitering at low altitude. Maximum speed of about 350 knots, which makes it the slowest fighter-type aircraft in the American inventory. Everything about the A-10 is a middle finger to elegance in favor of brutal, unglamorous effectiveness. Kiera Moss had wanted to fly Warthogs since she was 16 years old and watched one perform a demonstration at an air show in Reno. While her classmates were swooning over the Thunderbird's F-16s doing vertical climbs and barrel rolls, she'd been transfixed by the A-10's low, slow pass, the sound of that cannon firing blanks, the way the plane seemed to radiate purpose rather than grace. She'd applied to the Air Force Academy with a single-minded focus that had worried her parents and impressed her guidance counselor. She'd graduated in the top 15% of her class, gone through pilot training with scores high enough to have her pick of aircraft, and requested A-10s exclusively. The selection board had questioned that choice. One interviewer, a former F-15 pilot who logged 300 combat hours over Iraq, had leaned forward with genuine curiosity and asked why anyone would choose the oldest, slowest, ugliest plane in the inventory when she could fly anything else. Kiera's answer had been simple, because when someone's dying on the ground, they don't need fast, they don't need pretty, they need someone who will get low, get slow, and stay in the fight until the job is done. That's the warthog. That's what I want to be. She'd gotten her assignment, she'd excelled in training, and she'd deployed with expectations that bordered on naive about what combat would actually feel like. Afghanistan had educated her quickly and without gentleness about the gap between wanting to save lives and actually having to make the decisions that determined who lived and who didn't. Her first close air support mission had been over the Korangal Valley, supporting a Marine unit that had walked into a prepared ambush. She'd put rounds exactly where the ground controller directed, watched her gun camera feed show the results, and thrown up in her helmet the moment she was back at altitude. Her instructor pilot, Captain Marcus Webb, had waited until they were on the ground to tell her that the nausea was normal and that it never completely went away. You just got better at functioning through it. By her third deployment, she'd flown enough missions that the faces of the ground troops she'd supported had started to blur together. What didn't blur was the radio traffic that controlled panic when someone called for immediate close air support, the way voices changed when you put ordnance on target and the shooting stopped, the profound gratitude that came through even the most professional acknowledgments. She'd collected 47 confirmed saves, though she knew that number was low because not every mission generated the paperwork that made it official. She had 3 air medals. She had a Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission where she'd stayed overhead for 90 minutes in a whiteout snowstorm, delivering danger-close fire support without any functioning navigation aids beyond her targeting pod, and the calm voice of a Joint Terminal Attack Controller who trusted her enough to talk her onto targets he couldn't even see. And she had a reputation among the ground pounders as someone who would show up and who would stay until the job was done. Among some of her fellow pilots, she had a different reputation. There were whispers that she took unnecessary risks, that she violated minimum safe altitudes too frequently, that she extended missions beyond prudent fuel reserves, that she cared too much about the troops on the ground and not enough about bringing herself home intact. None of it had ever been put in writing, not officially, because her mission results were flawless and her aircraft had always come home functional. Until the morning she responded to that distress call 40 clicks outside her assigned sector and flew a crippled bird through 40 minutes of shouldn't be possible to save a sergeant she'd never met. The investigation centered on that decision, why she'd been in that airspace, why she'd assessed her damaged aircraft as capable of continuing the mission, why she'd engaged without proper clearance from higher command. Colonel Patricia Hendricks ran the investigation with the kind of thoroughness that suggested she already knew what conclusion she needed to reach and was building the paperwork to support it. She was a career officer who'd flown transport aircraft for 20 years and had spent the last 5 in increasingly administrative roles. She understood regulations, risk management, and the importance of maintaining good order and discipline. She did not understand the A-10 community, close air support doctrine, or the kind of decisions that pilots made when someone's life was measured in seconds. The interview took place in a windowless office at Kandahar Airfield, air conditioning struggling against the afternoon heat, a recording device spinning silently between them. "Lieutenant Moss, walk me through your decision-making process." Kiera sat with parade ground posture, hands folded, uniform immaculate despite 3 days of desk duty that had left her feeling like she was suffocating. "I was returning from a routine patrol over Helmand Province when I took anti-aircraft fire from a previously unreported position. 3 rounds connected, one through the right engine, one that severed the primary hydraulic line, one that damaged the navigation computer. And you didn't immediately proceed to the nearest suitable airfield." "Negative, ma'am. I assessed that I had sufficient control authority to complete the mission and that the insurgent position needed to be reported to prevent future aircraft from encountering the same threat." Colonel Hendricks made a note. The after-action report indicates you engaged that AAA position with your remaining ordnance. Affirmative. 2 Mavericks, both direct hits. The position was neutralized. And then, I was proceeding to fob shank when I intercepted a distress call on guard frequency. Ground element under immediate fire, multiple casualties, nearest QRF 20 minutes out. Hendricks looked up from her notes. That distress call came from an operation outside your assigned theater. You were not tasked to provide support in that sector. Negative, ma'am, but I was the only air asset in range to respond in time. With a damaged aircraft that you yourself described as having compromised capability, Kiera met the colonel's eyes. The aircraft was still functional. The troops were dying. The mathematics seemed straightforward. The silence that followed carried judgment. Colonel Hendricks set down her pen with careful precision. Lieutenant, regulations exist for a reason. We cannot have pilots making unilateral decisions to extend missions when their aircraft have sustained battle damage. What you saw as straightforward mathematics, I see as a pilot with insufficient judgment putting herself and a multi-million-dollar aircraft at risk for a mission she was not assigned. Kiera felt something cold settle in her chest. With respect, ma'am, that multi-million-dollar aircraft exists to support troops on the ground. That's the entire purpose of the A-10 platform. The purpose of every military asset is to serve within the structure of command authority and established protocols. You violated both. There it was, the fundamental disconnect. Colonel Hendricks saw an insubordinate pilot who'd exceeded her authority. Kiera had seen a sergeant bleeding out in the sand and had done what needed to be done. Ma'am, if I could, you're dismissed, Lieutenant. I'll have my recommendation completed by end of week. Kiera stood, saluted, and left before she could say something that would make her situation worse. She knew what was coming. She'd known since the moment those colonels had met her on the flight line at Fob Shank instead of the maintenance cruise. The Air Force had very specific ideas about acceptable risk, and she'd exceeded them. The fact that Master Sergeant Kovac was alive, because of it would be noted in the record, and then carefully set aside in favor of more important concerns about good order and proper procedure. She was in her quarters, staring at a wall and contemplating whether a military career she'd spent 12 years building was about to end in disgrace, when someone knocked. Major Rick Sutton stood in the doorway, 48 years old, leathery from 3 decades of flying in harsh conditions, wearing a flight suit that still smelled faintly of jet fuel despite the base laundry's best efforts. He was the squadron commander, her direct superior, and one of the few people whose opinion she actually valued. You look like someone shot your dog, Moss. Still waiting for the official bullet to the career, sir. Sutton invited himself in, closed the door, and settled into the room's single chair with the ease of someone who'd spent enough time deployed that comfort was relative. Talked to Hendricks this morning. She's recommending you be removed from flight status, formally reprimanded and reassigned to a non-flying billet. Kiera nodded. She'd expected worse, honestly. Probably could have been a court-martial if that sergeant hadn't written a statement calling you the bravest pilot he'd ever seen and requesting you be nominated for another DFC. Something shifted in Kiera's chest. He did what? 4-page letter delivered directly to the commanding general, very eloquent for a guy who was on enough morphine to tranquilize a horse when he wrote it. Sutton paused. Also doesn't hurt that every ground unit within 100 clicks has heard about what you did and that the A-10 community as a whole is ready to go to war with the bureaucrats over this. Sir, I don't want to cause problems for too late. You already did. Question is what we do about it. Sutton leaned forward. Here's the thing, Moss. Hendricks is right technically. You exceeded your authority. You took risks that went beyond acceptable parameters. You violated protocols that exist for good reasons. Kiera felt her jaw tight. But she's also never had to make the choice you made. She's never been the person who has to decide whether regulations matter more than lives. And she's never understood that the A-10 mission requires a different kind of pilot, the kind who sees close air support as a sacred trust instead of just another mission profile. He stood. The general is reviewing both Hendrix's recommendation and a counter-recommendation from me that you be restored to flight status after a brief stand-down period. He's aware that if he sides with Hendrix, he'll lose credibility with every ground combat unit in theater. He's also aware that if he sides with me, he'll be effectively saying that sometimes violations of protocol are acceptable if the outcome is positive. That's a hell of a position to put him in, sir. That's command. He gets paid to make hard calls. My money's on him, remembering that he used to be a grunt before he became a general. Major Sutton was right, but the decision took 3 weeks, and they were the longest weeks of Kiera's deployment. She flew a desk in operations, processing flight plans and weather data for missions other pilots were executing. She watched the board track aircraft call signs and mission statuses, watched her squadron mates launch and recover, and felt the absence of purpose like a physical wound. The other pilots were supportive in the way military personnel are when the system is eating one of their own quiet solidarity. The occasional appearance of coffee or contraband, snacks on her desk, careful avoidance of platitudes about everything working out. Captain Sarah Vance, who'd been through pilot training with Kiera and had been her wingman on 17 missions, cornered her one evening outside the chow hall. You're doing that thing where you internalize everything and convince yourself this is your fault. Kiera managed half a smile. Isn't it? You saved a guy's life. That's not a fault, that's the job. The job is following orders and maintaining proper risk assessment. The job is bringing the hate when someone needs it and getting home alive. You did both. Vance paused. Hendrix is a dinosaur who doesn't understand that close air support isn't about staying inside comfortable parameters. Sutton gets it. The general will get it. You just have to survive the bureaucracy long enough for sense to prevail. But Kiera had been in the military long enough to know that sense didn't always prevail, that careers could end over decisions that seemed obvious in the moment but looked reckless in the clarity of hindsight. She'd rolled the dice, and now she was waiting to see if they came up boxcars or snake eyes. The answer came not in a formal board or a ceremony, but in Major Sutton appearing in the operations center, finding Kiera at her desk, and dropping a flight roster on top of the weather reports she'd been reviewing. You're on the schedule for tomorrow, 0800 brief. Combat air patrol over the Arghandab Valley. Try not to get shot down on your first flight back. Kiera stared at the roster, her name next to her call sign Revenant 73 like the past 3 weeks had been a bad dream. The general's decision had come with conditions. Kiera would complete additional training on risk assessment and decision-making under stress. She would be assigned a check pilot to evaluate her judgment for the next 30 days. Any further incidents would result in immediate grounding with no second chances. And there would be a formal letter in her permanent file noting the violation of protocol, even if no official punishment was being administered. It was the kind of compromise that satisfied exactly no one too lenient for the by-the-book officers who believed regulations existed for good reasons, too harsh for the pilots who thought Kiera deserved a medal instead of additional scrutiny. But it meant she could fly again, and that was all that mattered. Her check pilot turned out to be Captain Marcus Webb, the instructor pilot who talked her through her first combat mission and who'd been flying A-10s since before Kiera had graduated high school. He met her at the aircraft the next morning, did his pre-flight inspection in silence, and didn't speak until they were both strapped in and running through the checklist. Just so we're clear, I requested this assignment. Kiera paused in the middle of setting her radios. Sir, Hendrix wanted to assign someone who'd ride you hard and write you up for every little deviation. I convinced Sutton that what you actually needed was someone who understood the difference between reckless and aggressive. I know which one you are. And which one is that, sir? Webb's voice carried through the intercom with dry humor. Aggressive, reckless pilots don't bring their aircraft home. You've got almost 200 combat missions, and this was the first time you came back with battle damage. That's not luck. That's someone who knows exactly how far they can push and still maintain control. He paused. But you came right up to the line, Moss. Next time you might cross it, and then there won't be enough political capital in theater to save your career. Understood, sir. Good. Let's go remind people why the Warthog is the best close air support platform ever built. The flight was textbook: patrol their assigned sector, check in with ground controllers, return to base. No contact, no drama, no moments that required split-second decisions about acceptable risk. 3 days later, they got their first real mission. A firebase in the Tangi Valley was taking sporadic fire from a tree line approximately 800 meters to the north. Ground forces had eyes on but couldn't safely advance to engage. They needed someone to identify the firing position and deliver precision fires that would eliminate the threat without endangering nearby structures. Kiera and Webb arrived on station 15 minutes after the initial call established contact with the ground tactical air controller and began their reconnaissance pattern. The valley was classic Afghan terrain: steep ridges, scattered compounds, vegetation thick enough to provide concealment but not enough to prevent thermal imaging from being effective. Webb took the lead, his aircraft slightly ahead and to the right, while Kiera maintained position and monitored. Ground control: Hog 73 has multiple heat signatures in the northern tree line. Unable to confirm hostile intent at this time. Request guidance. The JTAC's voice came back calm and professional. Hog 73, ground control. We've taken 3 rounds of effective fire from that location in the past 10 minutes. Authorization is cleared hot on your discretion. Cleared hot meant they had permission to engage, but discretion meant the decision was theirs. If they misidentified the target, if those heat signatures were civilians, if they put rounds into the wrong location, the consequences would be entirely on them. Webb clicked twice acknowledge and began a descent that would bring his aircraft into firing position. Kiera watched the targeting pod feed, watched the shapes resolve into men with weapons moving through the trees with the kind of tactical discipline that suggested training rather than farmers. I've got visual confirmation on at least 4 military-age males with long arms, moving with purpose toward the firebase perimeter. Copy that, 7-3. You're cleared to engage. Webb's aircraft jinked left, lined up and fired. A Maverick missile detached from the wing, motor igniting, streaking downrange with perfect precision. The explosion was captured on both their gun cameras. The tree line erupting, secondary detonations suggesting ammunition had been present, the heat signatures disappearing from thermal. Ground control: Hog flight, splash 4 confirmed enemy KIA. Area is clear. The JTAC acknowledged, thanked them with genuine warmth and cleared them to return to base. On the flight home, Webb's voice came through the intercom. You see how that worked? Positive identification, proper authorization, measured response. That's how it's supposed to go. Yes, sir. The mission you flew that got you grounded, that wasn't how it's supposed to go. Kiera felt defensive mechanisms engage. I understand that, sir, but let me finish. That mission wasn't supposed to work that way because the situation was already broken before you arrived. Someone screwed up the route planning. Someone didn't identify that ambush site. Someone sent a ground element into a kill zone without adequate support. By the time you showed up, all the good options were gone. You were left choosing between bad and worse. He paused. But you still have to operate within the system, Moss, because the system is what keeps us from becoming cowboys who do whatever feels right in the moment. You understand the difference? I think so, sir. Good, because there's going to be another mission like that. Something where the options are all bad and you have to make a choice in about 3 heartbeats. When that happens, you need to make the right call and be able to articulate why it was right. Not just that it worked out, that's outcome bias. But why the decision itself was defensible given what you knew at the time. It was the clearest explanation anyone had given her about what had actually gone wrong, and Kiera found herself respecting Webb even more than she had before. For the next 3 weeks, they flew together almost daily. Routine patrols, close air support missions, shows of force where their mere presence overhead was enough to discourage hostile activity. Webb critiqued everything: her radio discipline, her fuel management, her positioning relative to ground threats, the way she communicated with ground controllers. It was exhausting and educational in equal measure, and by the end of the evaluation period, Kiera felt like she'd learned more about being an effective close air support pilot than in her previous 2 deployments combined. Webb's final evaluation was 3 pages long and concluded with a single sentence that mattered more than all the preceding analysis. Lieutenant Moss demonstrates exceptional technical skills, sound tactical judgment, and the kind of commitment to the ground support mission that makes her exactly the pilot you want overhead when situations deteriorate. The check pilot requirement was lifted. Kiera returned to normal flight status, her schedule filling with the usual mix of patrols and missions. The letter remained in her file, a permanent notation that she'd once pushed too far, but it became just another piece of paper in a career full of them. Life on deployment returned to its normal rhythm: fly, sleep, maintain aircraft, repeat. Weeks blurred into months. The Afghan winter came, bringing snow to the mountains and mud to the valleys, making flight operations more challenging but no less necessary. Kiera logged her 200th combat mission, then her 250th. She accumulated more air medals, more confirmed saves, more nights lying in her rack thinking about the faces she'd seen through her targeting pod and wondering if the math she was doing in the cockpit, weighing lives and risks and acceptable collateral damage, would ever feel like something other than playing God with insufficient information. Captain Sarah Vance once asked her, late one night in the pilot's break room, if she ever regretted the decision that had nearly cost her career. Kiera had thought about it seriously before answering. I regret not being smarter about how I did it. I regret putting my squadron commander in a position where he had to fight for me. I regret the doubt it planted in some people's minds about whether I can be trusted to make good decisions. She'd paused. But I don't regret that Sergeant Kovac went home to his family instead of home in a box. And if the exact same situation happened tomorrow, I'd make the exact same choice. Vance had nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. That's why you're Revenant. Things that should be dead but keep fighting anyway. The deployment eventually ended, as all deployments do. Kiera rotated back to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, traded the moonscape of Afghanistan for the relative civilization of Tucson, and tried to readjust to a life where people didn't carry weapons to the bathroom, and where the most dangerous thing about any given day was usually the traffic on I-10. She taught at the weapons school. She mentored younger pilots. She flew training missions that felt simultaneously more relaxed and less meaningful than combat operations. The call sign followed her, as call signs do. The other pilots knew the story, or various versions of it, and Revenant carried connotations that ranged from respect to caution, depending on who was using it. Some of the younger pilots looked at her like she was proof that aggressive flying and solid values could coexist. Some of the older instructors looked at her like she was a cautionary tale waiting for its final chapter. Kiera tried not to think too hard about which interpretation was more accurate. 2 years after that deployment ended, she was promoted to captain. 4 years after that, she made major. Her career progressed in the way careers do when you're competent but not exceptional, valuable but not irreplaceable. She accumulated thousands of hours in the cockpit, became one of the senior A-10 pilots in the Air Force, and watched as the debates continued about whether the Warthog would finally be retired in favor of newer, faster, more expensive aircraft that could do everything, except the low-altitude, danger-close support mission that had been the A-10's entire reason for existing. The Air Force kept trying to kill the program. Congress kept bringing it back. The troops who depended on that distinctive silhouette overhead kept writing letters explaining that no other aircraft could do what the Warthog did. And pilots like Kiera kept flying missions that proved the platform's value even as the institutional Air Force tried to move on to something shinier. She was a lieutenant colonel, assigned to a staff position at the Pentagon, contemplating whether she'd flown her last combat mission, when the war in Ukraine changed every calculation about what modern warfare looked like and what capabilities would matter in a near-peer conflict. Suddenly, the A-10's ability to operate from rough airfields, to survive battle damage, to deliver close air support in contested environments, looked less like an outdated relic and more like exactly what would be needed if the shooting ever started with Russia or China. The retirement plans were quietly shelved. The aircraft got upgrades, new wings, updated avionics, precision weapons. And experienced pilots like Kiera found themselves being pulled back into tactical roles, their institutional knowledge suddenly valuable again. When the deployment orders came, nobody was particularly surprised. The rotation was to Poland, part of NATO's enhanced forward presence, a message to Moscow that Article 5 wasn't a theoretical commitment. Kiera arrived at Lask Air Base in February, watched snow fall on the flight line, and felt oddly grateful that if she was going to spend 6 months in a place that wasn't home, at least it had proper heating and reliable internet. The mission set was different from Afghanistan: less close air support, more deterrence and readiness. They flew patrols along the border with Belarus. They practiced intercepts and combat scenarios. They worked with Polish and Baltic forces, learning to coordinate across languages and different tactical doctrines. And they waited because that's what deterrence was, the hope that being ready to fight meant you wouldn't have to. Kiera was flight lead on a routine patrol along the Ukrainian border when the alert came through. Russian forces had pushed across in a major offensive near Kharkiv. Ukrainian positions were being overrun. NATO wasn't officially involved, couldn't be without triggering Article 5 obligations that nobody was ready to invoke, but there were ways of providing support that lived in the gray areas of international law. The brief was given by a colonel who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Ukraine has requested close air support under emergency protocols. We have authorization to provide that support using volunteer air crews. Emphasis on volunteer. Nobody will be ordered to do this, and there will be no negative consequences for declining. He'd paused. But if you do volunteer, understand that you'll be flying into a contested environment with a near-peer adversary who has modern surface-to-air capabilities. The rules of engagement are straightforward: defend yourself and support designated Ukrainian units. Expect resistance. Expect things to go sideways. Questions? Kiera had raised her hand. What's the withdrawal plan if we take battle damage? Get across the border and punch out if you have to. Nay, forces will handle recovery, but the preference is you bring the aircraft home. Another pilot, younger, less experienced. Are we really doing this? Supporting one side in a conflict we're not officially part of. The colonel's expression had been weary. We're providing humanitarian assistance to a democratic nation under attack by an authoritarian aggressor. That's the official line. Practically, we're proving that NATO's capabilities extend beyond strongly worded statements. Anyone who's not comfortable with that, the door's right there. Nobody had walked out. Kiera and 3 other pilots, Captain Sarah Vance, now also at Lask, Major Tom Bradley and Captain James Chen, volunteered immediately. They launched 4 hours later, 2 A-10s flying in mutual support, loaded with Mavericks, cluster munitions, and 30mm ammunition. The flight across the border felt surreal, like crossing an invisible line between the world as it was supposed to be and the world as it actually existed. Below them, darkness hid the movement of armies, but thermal imaging revealed the truth: columns of vehicles, artillery positions, the scattered signatures of infantry moving through terrain that offered little cover. Their contact was a Ukrainian forward air controller whose English was heavily accented but professionally precise. Hog flight. This is Titan 2-1. We have Russian mechanized infantry advancing on our position from the northeast. Request immediate close air support. Danger close. Friendlies are 200 meters from target area. Danger close meant exactly what it sounded like. The margin for error was measured in seconds and meters, and getting it wrong meant killing the people they were trying to save. Kiera acknowledged, checked her targeting pod, and found the target BMP infantry fighting vehicles, maybe a dozen, moving in formation with supporting infantry. They were good, whoever was commanding them. They were using terrain effectively, maintaining dispersion, advancing with the kind of tactical competence that suggested professional soldiers rather than conscripts. The Ukrainian position was marked by infrared strobes visible only through night vision, exactly where the controller had indicated. 200 meters was danger close. 150 meters was insanity. Kiera made her calculations approach angle, wind, ballistics. The fact that her 30-millimeter rounds had a dispersion pattern that was lethal for 50 meters in every direction from point of impact. She could do this. She'd done it before. But the targets were moving, the friendlies were close, and the consequences of miscalculation were catastrophic. Vance, you've got the western element. I'll take the eastern formation. Guns only, he rounds. Approach from the north to keep the impact pattern away from friendly positions. Vance acknowledged. They split, curving through the night sky, lining up their runs with precision that came from hundreds of hours of training and dozens of combat missions. Kiera's aircraft dropped to 500 feet, the altitude where the Warthog was most effective and most vulnerable, where precision was possible but so was getting shot down by anything from a shoulder-fired missile to concentrated small arms fire. Her targeting computer painted the lead BMP. The cannon spun up. And she fired. The effect was immediate and devastating. 30-millimeter high-explosive rounds designed to kill tanks tore through the lighter armor of the BMPs like they were made of cardboard. The lead vehicle exploded, secondary detonations suggesting the ammunition had cooked off. The second vehicle tried to turn, but Kiera's stream of fire tracked it, and it too came apart in fire and fragmentation. The supporting infantry scattered. Some of them started firing back, tracer rounds reaching up through the darkness, close enough that Kiera could see them but not close enough to connect. She pulled up, watching her gun camera confirm kills, then banked hard as a missile launch alert screamed in her cockpit. Someone down there had a MANPAD, a man-portable air defense system, and they just tried to kill her. He deployed flares, jerked the aircraft through a turn that made her vision narrow at the edges, and felt the missile pass behind her, proximity fuse detonating but too far away to cause damage. Vance's voice came through. I'm taking ground fire, multiple sources, breaking off. Copy that. Titan 2-1 Hog flight targets destroyed, but we've got active air defense. Request immediate suppression of enemy air defense positions. Understood. Hog flight. Ukrainian artillery is engaging now. Stand by. Kiera orbited at altitude, watching as artillery fire began impacting around the Russian positions, walking rounds across suspected air defense locations. It was crude but effective. The ground fire slackened, then stopped. Hog flight, you're clear to engage remaining targets. They made 3 more passes, destroying the remaining BMPs and scattering the infantry. When they finally cleared the area and headed back across the border, both aircraft were low on fuel and ammunition but undamaged. The debrief took hours. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything: target descriptions, enemy reactions, the effectiveness of their air defense network, the quality of their tactical coordination. What Kiera mostly remembered was the precision required, the way every decision had to be made in compressed time with incomplete information, the awareness that people were dying based on whether she put rounds 10 meters left or right of her aim point. They flew 12 missions over the next month, all volunteers, all deniable if anything went wrong. They lost one aircraft. Captain Chen took a hit from a surface-to-air missile, ejected successfully, and was recovered by Polish special forces in an operation that officially never happened. His aircraft, and the question of what an American A-10 was doing over Ukraine, became a minor diplomatic incident that was resolved with carefully worded statements and background assurances. Kiera kept flying. They all did. The Ukrainian forces they supported started to push back. The Russian advance stalled. Whether the A-10s were decisive or just helpful was a question for historians, but the Ukrainian ground controllers knew exactly what difference they made, and that was enough. When the rotation ended and they returned to the United States, Kiera had added 32 combat missions to her logbook and had lost count of the number of times she'd been shot at. She'd also proven again that the Warthog could still do things no other aircraft could match. The Air Force noticed. The retirement plans were shelved indefinitely, and Lieutenant Colonel Kiera Moss, call sign Revenant, found herself being used as evidence in congressional hearings about why the platform needed to be maintained. It was strange, watching clips of generals she'd never met citing her missions as proof of concept, talking about her like she was a data point rather than a person. But if it kept the aircraft she loved flying and the mission she believed in funded, she could live with being a statistic. She made full colonel 3 years later, got offered a position at Air Combat Command, planning future close air support doctrine. Spent 2 years pushing paper and attending meetings where decisions that would affect tactics for the next decade were made by people who hadn't flown combat missions in their lives. It was important work, and she was good at it, but some part of her missed the simplicity of being in the cockpit, where the problems were immediate and the solutions were measured in precision rather than politics. She was considering retirement, contemplating whether 25 years was enough and whether there was a second act to a life that had been defined entirely by military service, when the Chinese made their move on Taiwan. The invasion wasn't a surprise. Analysts had been predicting it for years, and the buildup had been visible for months. What was surprising was the scale and the coordination. Amphibious landings on 3 beaches, airborne assaults on key airfields, cyber attacks that took down half of Taiwan's communications infrastructure in the first hour, and a commitment of resources that suggested Beijing had decided that now was the moment, consequences be damned. The American response was immediate and massive. Carrier strike groups surged toward the Taiwan Strait. Air Force units deployed from bases in Japan, Guam, and the Philippines. And someone, somewhere in the Pentagon, remembered that the A-10 could operate from rough airfields, could provide close air support in contested environments, and didn't need the sophisticated logistics that more modern aircraft demanded. The call came to Colonel Moss while she was sitting in her office at Langley, reviewing doctrine updates that now seemed entirely theoretical. "How quickly can you get to Kadena?" She'd paused, phone against her ear, trying to reorient her thinking from staff officer to combat pilot. "Sir, I haven't flown an operational mission in 18 months. You've got 7,000 hours in the A-10 and more combat experience than any other officer of your rank. Taiwan needs close air support, and they need someone who can coordinate it effectively. You'd be flying and planning. Can you do it?" Kiera thought about all the reasons to say no. She was 52 years old. She had a staff position. She hadn't maintained the same physical readiness she'd had as a younger pilot. But she also knew that if she said no, if she stayed safe and let someone else take the risk, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering if she could have made a difference. "I can be at Kadena in 36 hours, sir." The flight to Japan was surreal. Sitting in the back of a C-17 with 24 other personnel being rushed to forward positions, trying to process that she was about to fly combat missions against an enemy with capabilities that made Afghanistan and Ukraine look like training exercises. The Chinese had modern fighters, sophisticated air defense systems, and the advantage of operating close to their home bases, while American forces were projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean. The briefing at Kadena was sobering. Taiwan's Air Force had been badly mauled in the first 72 hours. They still had aircraft, but they were running out of pilots and trying to defend against an enemy with numerical superiority. American air power was making a difference, but the air defense environment was the most dangerous since Vietnam. Multiple aircraft had been lost. Pilots were getting shot down at rates that hadn't been seen in decades. And into this meat grinder, someone had decided to send A-10s, because the Taiwanese ground forces were being hard-pressed and needed the kind of close air support that only the Warthog could provide. Kiera met her squadron, a mix of experienced pilots pulled from various units, younger aviators who'd volunteered, and a few reservists who'd been activated specifically for this deployment. They were good people, professional and committed, but most of them had never flown against an enemy with the capability to actually kill them. She gathered them in the briefing room, looked at faces that ranged from confident to terrified, and tried to find words that would be honest without being demoralizing. "Most of you know my call sign and probably know at least some version of the stories. What you need to know is this. The A-10 was designed to survive in the worst possible environment, supporting ground troops when everything else has been blown out of the sky. We're going to prove that design philosophy works. We're going to take care of the troops on the ground. And we're going to come home. She paused. But I won't lie to you. This is going to be the most dangerous flying any of us have ever done. The Chinese have capabilities we haven't faced before. Some of us might not make it back. So I need everyone to make a decision right now. Are you committed to this mission, or do you need to step back? No judgment either way. Nobody stepped back. They launched the next morning, 12 A-10s flying in elements of two, headed across the Taiwan Strait toward assigned sectors where Taiwanese and Chinese forces were locked in combat that would determine whether the island remained independent or became another province of the People's Republic. The flight across open water felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Chinese radar was tracking them from the moment they took off. Somewhere out there were fighters that could intercept them, missiles that could reach them, an entire military apparatus designed to deny American forces the ability to operate freely. But the A-10 flew low, used the terrain when they reached Taiwan, and relied on speed or the lack thereof to be a difficult target for systems designed to engage fast movers. Kiera's first target was a Chinese mechanized unit advancing on Taichung, threatening to split the island's defenses. The Taiwanese forces were falling back, trading ground for time, trying to establish a defensive line that could hold. They needed the Chinese advance slowed, needed casualties inflicted, needed someone to give them breathing room to regroup. The controller was a Taiwanese officer whose English was precise and whose voice carried the strain of someone who'd been in combat for 3 days straight. Hog flight. We have Type 99 tanks, approximately battalion strength, advancing on Highway 1. Request immediate engagement. Type 99s were China's main battle tanks, modern and well-armored, equipped with active protection systems that could defeat incoming missiles. They weren't easy kills, but they were still vulnerable to the A-10's gun. Kiera found them through her targeting pod, a column of armor moving with tactical discipline, infantry fighting vehicles interspersed, self-propelled artillery in support. It was a professional force, well-commanded, dangerous. She lined up her approach, checked that Vance was in supporting position, and began her run. The GAU-8 opened up, and depleted uranium penetrators began their work. The lead tank took multiple hits, armor shattering, internal systems failing, the vehicle grinding to a halt. The second tank tried to traverse its turret, looking for the threat, but Kiera's second burst caught it at the join between turret and hull, and it too died. Then the air defense systems came alive. Missile launch alerts screamed in her cockpit, not one but multiple, the Chinese having learned that American aircraft required saturation fire to guarantee kills. She deployed countermeasures, broke hard right, felt G-forces compress her chest, watched her vision narrow, and prayed that the missile's seeker head would choose a flare instead of her tailpipe. One missile detonated behind her, close enough that shrapnel scored her vertical stabilizer. The second kept tracking, kept coming, and she had about 3 seconds before it turned her into a fireball. She dove, dropping toward the deck, putting terrain between her and the missile, trading altitude for survival. The weapon tried to follow, clipped a hillside, and exploded in a fireball that Kiera saw in her mirrors. Jesus Christ, Vance's voice was shaken. You okay, Revenant? Still here, continuing attack. They made 2 more passes, destroying 6 tanks and several IFVs before fuel and ammunition states forced them to disengage. The Chinese advance had been disrupted, forced to disperse and deal with casualties, buying the Taiwanese forces the time they needed. But Kiera's aircraft had taken damage that near miss had done more than score the stabilizer. Her hydraulics were showing anomalous readings. Her right engine was running rough, and she had 90 miles of hostile airspace between her and Kadena. The flight home was tense, every warning light and unusual vibration feeling like a countdown to catastrophic failure. But the Warthog, stubborn and overbuilt, kept flying. She crossed the coast, cleared Taiwanese airspace, and pointed toward Okinawa with the distinct sense that she was asking the aircraft for more than it was designed to give. 50 miles out, The right engine flamed out. She shut it down, ran through emergency procedures, and continued on a single turbofan that wasn't designed to carry the aircraft alone, but was doing it anyway. 20 miles out, the hydraulics failed completely. Manual reversion meant she was controlling the aircraft through cables and pulleys, flying it like something from World War II, every input requiring physical force and exact timing. Kadena Tower had been monitoring her situation since the engine failure and had emergency crews standing by. Kiera lined up on the runway with hands that wanted to shake and a determination that went beyond stubbornness into something like spite. The Warthog had carried her through 3 wars and 30 years of flying. It had brought her home from situations that should have killed her. She would be damned if she was going to lose it to battle damage when the runway was in sight. The landing was controlled chaos too fast because she couldn't bleed speed without hydraulics, too hard because she couldn't flare properly, the aircraft touching down and immediately wanting to depart the runway. She fought it, muscle and will against physics, and somehow kept it centered long enough for the emergency braking to grab. The rolled to a stop 2,000 feet down the runway, trailing smoke from the dead engine, hydraulic fluid leaking onto the tarmac, but intact. Kiera shut down systems with hands that had finally started shaking and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the aircraft tick and settle before ground crews arrived and she could finally climb out. The maintenance chief took one look at the damage and whistled. "Ma'am, this bird should not have made it home." But it did. Yes, ma'am, that it did. They flew 96 missions over Taiwan in the next month. They lost 4 aircraft to surface-to-air missiles, one to a mechanical failure that forced an ejection, one to a Chinese fighter that got through the CAP and caught an A-10 during its most vulnerable moment. They saved countless lives. They disrupted Chinese advances, bought time for defensive positions to be established, proved that even in a modern near-peer conflict, close air support still mattered. And when the Chinese offensive finally stalled, when international pressure and unsustainable casualties forced Beijing to accept a ceasefire that left Taiwan independent and bloodied but unbroken, the A-10s had proven their value one more time. Colonel Kiera Moss returned to the United States with battle-damaged scars on her aircraft, a Distinguished Service Medal for her leadership under fire, and the knowledge that she'd pushed her luck about as far as it could go. She retired 6 months later, 28 years of service, more combat missions than she'd ever bothered to count, and a reputation that had evolved from controversial to legendary without her quite noticing when the transition happened. The retirement ceremony was small, just her squadron and a few senior officers who'd known her throughout her career. Major Sutton was there, now a brigadier general, looking distinguished and just slightly uncomfortable in his dress uniform. When it was his turn to speak, he kept it brief. There are pilots who follow regulations perfectly and accomplish nothing remarkable. There are pilots who achieve remarkable things and leave chaos in their wake. And then there's Colonel Moss, who figured out how to do remarkable things while teaching the rest of us that sometimes the regulations need to be interpreted with wisdom rather than followed blindly. She's been the conscience of the A-10 community for 2 decades, and we're losing something important when she leaves. He'd paused. But mainly, I'm just grateful she's finally going to stop making me defend her decisions to colonels who have never made a hard choice in their lives. The audience had laughed, and Kiera had felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for years. The constant awareness that she was being watched, judged, measured against standards that sometimes valued caution over effectiveness. Civilian life was strange at first. She bought a house outside Tucson, near the base but not too near, with a view of the mountains and enough distance from her neighbors that the sound of aircraft overhead felt like memory rather than immediate presence. She consulted for aerospace companies developing next-generation close air support systems. She wrote doctrine papers that actually got read by people planning the future of air combat. She mentored younger pilots who sought her out for advice about how to balance aggression with judgment, how to survive in a military culture that often valued conformity over initiative. And slowly, She adjusted to a life where her decisions didn't determine whether someone lived or died, where mistakes had consequences measured in embarrassment rather than body counts, where the most dangerous thing she did most days was drive to the grocery store through Tucson traffic. 3 years into retirement, she was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy, addressing cadets who were at the beginning of the journey she'd completed. She'd prepared remarks about duty and service and the importance of technical competence, but standing at the podium, looking at faces that reminded her of her younger self, eager, idealistic, convinced that they understood what they were getting into, she set aside her notes. I'm going to tell you about the day I almost lost my career because I made a choice that seemed obvious in the moment but looked reckless to people who weren't there. She told them about Master Sergeant Kovac, about the damaged A-10, about flying 40 minutes on prayers and spite to save someone she'd never met. The lesson isn't that you should ignore regulations or that good outcomes justify risky decisions. The lesson is that you need to develop the judgment to know when the rules serve the mission and when they're obstacles to doing what's right. That judgment comes from experience, from mentors, from making mistakes and learning from them. And it requires the moral courage to stand by your decisions even when they're being questioned by people who think they know better. She paused. But here's what they won't tell you in your classes or your training. The hardest part isn't making the decision in the moment. The hardest part is living with the knowledge that your judgment, your skill, your willingness to take risk or refuse it, that determines whether someone goes home to their family or goes home in a coffin. That's what military service actually means. Not the ceremonies or the awards or the tradition. It means accepting that weight and carrying it for as long as you wear the uniform. The cadets had been silent, and Kiera wondered if she'd been too honest, too dark, if she'd scared them. Then a young woman in the front row, sharp-eyed and intense, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you know if you have what it takes to carry that weight?" Kiera had smiled. "You don't until you try, but I can tell you this. The fact that you're asking the question means you're already thinking seriously about what matters. Hold on to that. Don't let the institution sand down your edges. And remember that being a good pilot means being technically perfect, but being a good officer means being willing to make the hard calls." Years passed. The A-10 kept flying, kept proving its value, kept being scheduled for retirement, and then reprieved when someone realized that nothing else could do what it did. Kiera watched from the outside, no longer part of the community except in memory and consultation, but proud that the platform she'd championed was still in service. She was 73 years old, long since adjusted to civilian life, when she received an invitation to attend a ceremony at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The A-10 was finally being retired for real this time, after 60-plus years of service, and they were dedicating a memorial to the platform and the pilots who'd flown it. She almost didn't go. The military had been her life for so long, and being around it as an outsider felt strange, like visiting a house you used to live in and finding it occupied by people who'd changed everything. But something pulled her back, maybe curiosity about how they'd memorialize an aircraft that had never been loved for its elegance, but had been respected for its effectiveness. The memorial was simple: a decommissioned A-10, tail number 731665, mounted on pylons with a plaque listing the aircraft's history and the pilots who'd flown it in combat. But it was the aircraft itself that caught Kiera's attention. That tail number was familiar. She'd flown 665. She'd flown it on that first deployment, on missions in Afghanistan, on training exercises, on the day she pushed damaged aircraft 40 miles to save a sergeant she'd never met. Someone had chosen this specific aircraft, had preserved it, had decided it represented the A-10's legacy. She stood in front of it, looking at the scarred titanium, the patches where battle damage had been repaired, the wear patterns that told a story of decades in service. A voice beside her said, "I thought you'd appreciate seeing it again." She turned. Major Sutton, General Sutton, now 4 stars, somehow stood there looking like he'd aged approximately 1,000 years, but with eyes that still held the same dry humor she remembered. "You picked this aircraft specifically. Seemed appropriate. The plane that wouldn't quit, flown by the pilot who wouldn't quit. They stood together in silence, watching as current pilots and veterans mingled, as speeches were given about service and sacrifice and the end of an era. Kiera thought about all the missions, all the decisions, all the times she'd strapped into an aircraft and flown into situations where skill and luck would determine whether she came home. "Do you think we made a difference?" she asked quietly. Sutton was quiet for a long moment. "I think about the ground troops who are alive because we showed up. I think about the missions where close air support was the difference between victory and defeat. I think about the fact that for 60 years, whenever someone was in trouble, they could call for the hog and know that someone would show up and fight." He paused. "So yeah, I think we made a difference. Not the kind that gets written about in history books, but the kind that mattered to the people we saved." Kiera nodded. It was enough. It had to be enough. The ceremony continued, but she slipped away before the formal conclusion, walked to her car, and drove home through the desert twilight. That night she dreamed of flying. Not the complex, dangerous missions of her career, but something simpler, just her and an aircraft, the sky infinite above, the desert stretching below, the pure joy of flight that had drawn her to aviation in the first place. When she woke, she felt at peace in a way she hadn't in years. She'd carried the weight. She'd made the hard calls. She'd brought her people home more often than not. And now, finally, she could set the burden down and know that she'd done what she'd set out to do. She'd been the pilot you wanted overhead when everything went wrong. The Warthog was gone from active service, preserved in museums and memories, but its legacy remained in the doctrine it had shaped, the missions it had enabled, the lives it had saved. And somewhere always, there would be pilots like Lieutenant Kiera Moss had been, young, determined, convinced they could make a difference, strapping into aircraft and flying into danger because someone on the ground needed help. The call signs would change. The aircraft would evolve, but the mission would remain the same. And that, Kiera thought, was something worth having spent a life supporting. Master Sergeant Danny Kovac, retired now, with grandchildren and a construction business in Montana, still told the story sometimes. About the day he'd been bleeding out in the Afghan desert, certain he was going to die, when the most beautiful sound in the world had cut through the air. About the A-10 that shouldn't have been there, flown by a pilot who'd pushed a damaged aircraft beyond reasonable limits because someone needed help. About the call sign Revenant and what it meant to be something that refused to stay dead. He tried to find her afterward to say thank you properly, but the military had a way of shuffling people around, and by the time he'd tracked down contact information, she'd retired and disappeared into civilian life. But sometimes, watching the Montana sky, he'd hear a jet overhead and remember that morning, remember the smoke-trailing Warthog and the pilot who decided that regulations mattered less than lives. And he'd silently thank Lieutenant Colonel Kiera Moss, call sign Revenant, for the years he'd gotten to live that he shouldn't have had. The sky remembers all the pilots who have crossed it. The desert remembers all the blood spilled into its sand. And somewhere between memory and legend, the stories persist of aircraft that refused to die, of pilots who wouldn't quit, of missions that succeeded because someone made the hard choice and lived with the consequences. This was one of those stories. Not unique, perhaps, but true. And in the end, that's what mattered, not the medals or the recognition or even the career that had nearly been destroyed for doing the right thing. What mattered was that when someone needed help, she'd shown up. That when the choice was between safe and right, she'd chosen right. That when the odds were against success, she'd tried anyway. The Warthog is gone now, preserved in static displays and documentary footage. But the mission continues because there will always be people on the ground who need someone overhead. There will always be situations where the math is brutal and the choices are hard. There will always be pilots who look at that reality and decide they're willing to carry that weight. Lieutenant Colonel Kiera Moss, call sign Revenant, had been one of them. The sky had been her office. The A-10 had been her tool. The mission had been her purpose. And the lives saved, those innumerable, uncounted, mostly anonymous lives that continued because she'd made choices that others questioned, those were her legacy. Somewhere above the Arizona desert, An old fighter pilot watched the sky and remembered what it felt like to fly.